Welcome to the Altruistic Libertarian, advocate for a genuinely free society. I'm Anthony Wheeler, and today in our penultimate episode we discuss impediments to social change. Impediments to change. Realization of a genuinely free society is extremely problematic, and the odds against ever approaching such a thing astonishingly high. Under the best of circumstances, making substantial changes is extraordinarily difficult, let alone ones with such broad and embedded opposition. I quote, "And it ought to be remembered that there is nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct, or more uncertain in its success than to take the lead in the introduction of a new order of things. Because the innovator has for enemies all those who have done well under the old conditions, and lukewarm defenders in those who may do well under the new. This coolness arises partly from fear of the opponents, who have the laws on their side, and partly from the incredulity of men who do not readily believe in new things until they have had a long experience with them." Unquote. For those generally in favor of establishing a genuinely free society, identifying the obstacles can lead to strategies to overcome them, or at least charting a course in a favorable direction. The main obstacle to establishing a genuinely free society is that no one person, no one interest group will benefit from genuine freedom. Everybody benefits from increasing freedom in ways not entirely predictable or discernible, whereas benefits from government intervention are obvious and direct. Subsidies, favorable regulations, transfer payments, industrial contracts. The costs, however, for any particular program are widespread and distributed, yet in total greatly outweigh the aggregate benefits, based on the inefficiency of government administration and the damage done to potential capital investments and technical advance. The costs of government intervention are hidden and grave, while the benefits sparkling and specific, making it easy for politicians to convince themselves and their constituents that the intervention is worthy. Consider the magnitude of the resistance that would be generated from the following examples. Eliminating Social Security, a political bombshell. Millions of voters receiving benefits today, with any transition to private solution guaranteed to cause financial pain to beneficiaries along with taxpayers. A large and focused interest group, one that very few politicians wish to tangle with. Legalizing drugs. Shining a light in the dark underworld of the supply, shipment, and distribution of this multi-billion-dollar industry would be akin to knocking over a large fire ant mound and then sitting down in the midst of the frenzy. So much money at stake, so many willing to use violence to protect it. Prisons would lose inmates, government agencies would become redundant, and local law enforcement's mandate greatly reduced. Upholding morality. Most voters are comfortable with the status quo, thinking it right that the government use considerable resources to oppose what other people want to do. These voters believe the appropriate way to oppose immorality is to support laws against it, even when the immorality pertains to what a person does to themselves or with consenting adults, all in private. The principle that leads to such laws will impede their repeal. Eliminating public education. Teachers, unions, administrators all stand to lose their comfortable, predictable, and generally low-paid situation if public education was privatized. They would have to work hard to provide educational services that were demonstrably effective as opposed to simply going through the motions as so many do today. There is no consequences for complacency in public education, and that suits them just fine. As it is, parents and students have little choice other than opting out the system altogether and paying in full for alternatives. In addition, many parents would resist privatization simply out of fear of change. What if they can't afford to educate their children? And what if nobody provides suitable alternatives within their neighborhood? Revising the mission of the military. Greatly reducing U.S. military units overseas would raise resistance from local governments for various reasons. For one thing, the foreign governments would have to pay more for their own security. Secondly, local economies would be diminished with the closing of American bases. 3. Some Americans would resist reduction of global occupation based on national pride. And 4th, other Americans would resist the reduction based on perceived security concerns, or perhaps legitimate ones. 5th, some corporations that benefit from military spending would resist if it meant lower contracts. Other corporations might benefit if the U.S. restructured the military in ways that allowed them to project force without so many boots, planes, and tanks on the ground, but they wouldn't know that going in. Advocating for a strategic withdrawal does not necessarily equate to a smaller military or a cheaper one. The nation must be protected from foreign aggressors, and fielding the most technically advanced units would be essential to that defense. The U.S. must be poised to win any necessary war and maintain a dominance that will deter a potential aggressor. But this can be done without distorting world politics with troops and aircraft perceived as an occupation or imperialistic presence. Transforming transportation. Transitioning away from the private automobile that is responsible for so many deaths and injuries will be hard for the people to understand. They won't be able to see the possibilities and will resist the changes necessary to begin the transition. Supporting transportation alternatives would take a more sophisticated view of things than most people generally possess. Another implication with greatly limiting government intervention would be the elimination of power structures. A genuinely free society has no place for kings, powerful presidents, generals, and wars for them to fight. No princely bureaucrats ruling over thousands of people with millions and millions to spend. No need for social engineers sponsoring legislation that forces people to live in a manner different from what they would otherwise choose. No more urban renewal, funded with taxes extorted from the productive classes. No more protection for corporations threatened by competition and innovation. Another impediment to bringing about genuine freedom is the nature of those who desire freedom and abhor politics. They are unwilling to join the machine, to be party to the current power structure, to contribute to its perpetuation. Such people tend to avoid voting as they realize that casting a ballot implicates them in the results and brings with this civil action the tacit expectation that they support whoever wins. For those who don't accept the basic political premise of modern democratic society, that the majority should rule and that such rulers can expropriate whatever they desire, voting simply endorses the existing political system without offering genuine alternatives. So they opt out and stand aside from political action. Those who believe otherwise, who think they can change things from the inside and either support a political party or gain elective office with the intent to become the beast in order to kill it, are mistaken. Once part of the machine, they discover very few options to advocate, let alone bring about genuine change. If they persist in their disruptive ways, they will be sidelined, cut off from channels of power and influence. Quote, "Those following one party imagine they differ from those following another, whereas all, once they choose, join each other underneath, participate in one and the same nature, and vary only in appearance by the mask they assume." Unquote. In today's world, there is too much societal ossification, entrenched interests, and lack of inertia for genuine change. All those roads to hell paved with the golden bricks of good intentions, because the majority of people are convinced that an intrusive government helps people when it actually, on balance, harms them. The irony is that the people who would benefit the most from a free society, the poor, the underprivileged, the poorly educated, the sick, the unemployed, the stupid, are the same people that are targeted for help that justifies government intervention in the first place. Ignorant and or naive, good-hearted people support these programs with the intention of helping the unfortunate, when in fact they do more harm than help. Young people who seriously advocate for genuine freedom or actively question the magnitude of present-day intervention often find themselves faced with an unresponsive and denigrating cohort. Older citizens, despite their tendency to gripe about one thing or another, have grown accustomed to the current state, and regardless of the cost or inconvenience of one government agency or another, or the inefficiency so obviously displayed, or even the quality of arguments for change, simply don't have the energy to make the effort. And yet, the political system of the U.S. is capable of producing a genuinely free society. Constitutional amendments could be passed that expand the Bill of Rights in ways compatible with genuine freedom. Laws could be passed to limit government spending, eliminate government borrowing, and forbid excessive monetary expansion. Leaders in the White House and Congress could be elected to make the needed transformations. But doing so would require a massive sea change in the way most people think, an educational and spiritual transformation unlike anything in American history. The distance from here to a genuinely free society is so vast. Eagleton tells us that, and I quote, "To dissent from the entire social order is bound to look like madness from within the order itself." Unquote. Advocating for a genuinely free society certainly qualifies as dissent from an entire order. Making the changes necessary to realize genuine freedom would require levels of insight, effort, and commitment that probably doesn't exist within modern society. Most people and most voters will resist serious change. Even those who advocate dramatic change and do so with the best intentions and the highest ethical considerations generally favor more intervention, not less. There just aren't that many people committed to genuine freedom. Quote, "But the fathers of liberalism, Mill and Constant, want more than this minimum. They demand a maximum degree of non-interference compatible with the minimum demands of social life. It seems unlikely that this extreme demand for liberty has ever been made by any but a small minority of highly civilized and self-conscious human beings." Unquote. Given human nature and the wide-ranging differences in political opinion, it seems doubtful that a genuinely free society will ever be realized through peaceful means. Revolution? Since the time of Marx, communist revolutionaries around the world have faced similar challenges. Their ideology called for revolution and the dictatorship of the proletariat to establish their political vision. And they were correct. Very few pure communist governments have been elected or sustained by a free populace. In the most prominent cases, they came about through revolution, Russia in 1917, or civil war, China in 1949, both spawned, incidentally, within major international conflagrations, World War I in the first case, World War II in the latter. Many less radical regime changes have required violence to bring about, most prominently France in 1789 and America in 1776. These sentiments lingered into the late 70s, if not later, as I personally met people at that time who were predicting imminent revolution and fully prepared to participate. Despite the adverse nature of violence, there are those who accept its necessity, if not paradoxically. I quote, "That does not mean that we must be systematically opposed to the use of violence. I recognize that violence, under whatever form it may show itself, is a setback. But it is an inevitable setback because we are in a universe of violence. And if it is true that recourse to violence against violence risks perpetuating it, it is also true that it is the only means of bringing an end to it." Unquote. In some respects, Sartre is correct when he maintains the need for violence. In a genuinely free society, the government would exert violent force and the threat of violent force to protect citizens from assault, rape, and murder, and other crimes against their persons and property. Violence would also be deployed to protect the nation from aggressive peers. He is also correct in maintaining that violence begets violence, one of the principal justifications for minimizing it in the first place. But even if we limit the use of violence to those primary roles, policing and warfare, violence will not be eliminated from human affairs, so any promises to the contrary are misplaced. Human violence will only end when humans no longer exist. That being the case, the goal would be to minimize violence, and that is what those advocating a genuinely free society commit to do. Even the gently minded and good-hearted George Orwell allows for the possibility of initiating political violence when he writes, and I quote, "At some point or other, it may be necessary to use violence," unquote. He He is correct in that as a socialist, the application of political violence in some form would be required to bring about the society he envisions. Witness his own Animal Farm. But not the altruistic libertarian. Without equivocation, the altruistic libertarian vehemently rejects revolution as a viable alternative for political change, no matter how noble or correct, and rejects all forms of aggressive violence, whether by angry individuals, political dissidents, or sitting governments aimed at changing society. No arguments for political expediency or spiritual imperatives can justify shedding blood. Those who take to bombs and assassination perform acts of evil. Terrorists and violent revolutionaries are cast from the same mold and should be sent to an especially terrible ring in Dante's Inferno. It's impossible to prosecute a revolution without duplicating the crimes that justified the revolution in the first place. Quote, "Let us imagine that a revolutionary party systematically lies to its militants in order to protect them against uncertainties, cries of conscience, and adverse propaganda. The end pursued is the abolition of a regime of oppression. May one perpetuate oppression with the pretext of putting an end to it? Is it necessary to enslave man in order to free him? It will be said that the means are transitory. Not if it helps to create a lied to and lying mankind, for then the men who take power are no longer those who deserve to hold it, and the reasons one had for abolishing oppression are undermined by the way one goes about abolishing it." Unquote. The only justification for political violence arises when an oppressive regime threatens one's life or loved ones. Within most liberal democracies, such oppression doesn't exist to that extreme, and in fact, contain within their political system ways to alter the legal and regulatory structure in democratic fashion. This is truly the most important benefit of a genuine democracy, in that it replaced the need for bloody revolution. Instead of a war, regime change can happen at the ballot box should enough people become incensed. Instead of Lenin, Mao, or George Washington, the altruistic libertarian would point to Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King as role models to lead nonviolent societal change. Peaceful demonstrations and thoughtful opposition preferable to the indiscriminate use of bombs and bullets. Most revolutions don't deliver on promises anyway. Once violence begins, it becomes exceedingly difficult to manage the fallout, witness the French Revolution, and to implement thoughtful and just policies. Too many extremes occur in revolutionary and civil wars to expect a productive peace. Initiating or participating in revolutionary violence promises nothing but death and destruction, and is more likely to spawn something politically horrible than the paradise on earth most revolutionaries envision. No more frontiers. One way to establish a society very different from the incumbent would be to find a new land, one devoid of people, and make it your own. This occurred in ancient times when Greek colonies spread through the Mediterranean, and each new polis could write its own constitution and govern itself as it wished. The New World of the 17th century offered the same opportunity, and many Europeans seeking religious freedom braved the Atlantic to establish new colonies in the Americas. Some of them succeeded and grew into the 13 colonies that fought and won their independence from England. Even then, societal restrictions seemed too onerous for many, and they lit out for the territories to live unhindered from the shackles of civilization. It wasn't too many years before these brave souls reached the Pacific, and not too many years after that before civilization caught up with the frontier and pacified it. No more free ranges to roam. Roads, electricity, government, the internet, everywhere. In time, America will differ little from Europe in the sense that traditions will rule, bureaucracy will be deeply embedded in everyday life, and society will mostly conserve itself as is. Resistance to change will grow until society hovers around a bloated center. The two-party system in this country virtually guarantees this fate, given the impossibility of a third alternative to the centrist Democrats and Republicans. Is there a place on earth that might welcome the prospect of a genuinely free society? It's hard to say for sure, but I doubt it. The entire surface of the planet has been carved up by political entities, none of which are apt to relinquish their influence or give up their tax-based revenue or corporate extortion. When I was a child, the sea was the last frontier, and we watched with fascination as Jacques Cousteau led us into the deep. But the sea is an unlikely place for a new society, one based on individual freedom. Anyone who lives on or under the ocean will likely do so alone or within a very small cohort. After Cousteau came Star Trek, making space the final frontier. Some science fiction writers, Robert Heinlein in particular, depicted a new freedom in space in such books as Tunnel in the Sky and Time Enough for Love. But I suspect that any spaceborne society will resemble Sparta more than it does Athens. Even in Star Trek, on a 5-year mission, later to become indefinite, to explore new worlds, is supposedly a peaceful voyage, the Enterprise was fully armed with phasers and photon torpedoes, and the crew dressed in uniform and subject to ranks and commands. Any space-based society will be heavily dependent upon a shared infrastructure, whether it be a ship or planet-side, making it impossible to live independently given a specific social structure and the life-supporting technology. People in space will be heavily regimented, with little room to roam. Although Malcolm Reynolds in The Serenity made a good go of being free, we can hardly expect to duplicate his success. No more frontiers where a new society can be established. No place to start a new life without the burden of legacy. That means we haven't any choice but to fix the one we have. Well, that concludes our show for today. Next time we finish our program with the 40th and final episode. Until then, peace.